Just days before the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Western leaders have appealed for countries around the world to unite in providing long-term military support for Kyiv. The British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said now was the time to double down and provide more weapons. For his part, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, said while Russia must be defeated, it should not be crushed. They were both attending a security conference in the German city of Munich, from where our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, reports.
This conference has largely been a gathering of American and European leaders, a chance for them to reaffirm their support for Ukraine and demonstrate their resolve. So Rishi Sunak called for a new NATO charter to guarantee Ukraine's long-term security. And the US Vice President, Kamala Harris, formally accused Russia of committing crimes against humanity. But in the margins, there have been voices of doubt. Take the Prime Minister of Namibia, Sarah Kugonelwa Amadila. She opposed sending more arms to Ukraine and called for a peaceful resolution to the war. Her country, she said, had suffered recession, rising prices and disrupted supply chains.
This money by Russia in the West that is used to buy weapons to enable Russia and Ukraine to kill one another could be better utilized to promote development.
It's opinions like that, widely held across Africa, Asia and South America, that are concentrating transatlantic minds. A realisation among Western policymakers that almost 1 year after Russia's invasion, they need to remake the case for defending Ukraine. Thus, Mr. Sunak.
What's at stake in this war is even greater than the security and sovereignty of one nation. It's about the security and sovereignty of every nation. Because Russia's invasion, its abhorrent war crimes and irresponsible nuclear rhetoric are symptomatic of a broader threat to everything we believe in.
The Prime Minister later met Vice President Harris and they agreed a joint statement condemning what they chose to call a global war. She said there were moral and strategic reasons for all countries to defend Ukraine against what she called Russia's imperialist ambitions, to protect international rules that had ensured security and prosperity, not just for Americans, but for all the peoples of the world.
The fight in Ukraine has far-reaching global ramifications. No nation is safe in a world where one country can violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another.
So this war is being fought mainly on the muddy plains of eastern and southern Ukraine. But there is a global diplomatic battle too, and the West has a job on its hands to convince others of the rightness of its cause.
James Landale in Munich. The UN Secretary-General has announced the largest ever allocation from the UN's Central Emergency Fund to tackle what he described as the world's forgotten crises. Antonio Guterres said some of the $250 million would be spent helping those at risk of famine in Africa. He was speaking at the African Union Summit in Ethiopia.
Around the world today, 339 million people are in need of humanitarian aid, an increase of more than 25% since last year. And so today, here in Addis, I'm announcing the largest ever allocation from our United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, $250 million, to combat famine and to address unfunded emergencies.
Antonio Guterres. I asked our Africa regional editor, Mary Harper, how much of a difference this money will make.
It's important to put this into perspective. As you say, it sounds like an awful lot of money, but just about a week ago, humanitarian agencies launched a funding appeal just for Somalia, and they said they needed almost 10 times that just for the population of Somalia. And as the UN Secretary-General said, this is for the world's forgotten crises, some of which are in Africa, some of which are in other parts of the world. So even though it is the biggest ever allocation from this Central Emergency Fund, in terms of what it will actually do on the ground, it really will be doing little more than scratching the surface.
And what are the other issues being discussed at this summit?
The general food crisis caused by the fallout from the coronavirus pandemic, war in Europe, famine and drought, that's one of the key subjects for discussion, as is this thorny issue which has been going on for years and years of trying to establish a free trade deal for the whole of Africa. And always grand pronouncements are made and nothing really changes. And then perhaps most seriously, the multiple conflicts in Africa. There's increasing conflict in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Horn of Africa has many conflicts. The Sahel, almost anywhere you look, Mozambique, there are ongoing conflicts. And the UN Secretary General, he actually said that African leaders in Africa had kind of failed in terms of trying to find ways of even thinking about or reaching peace in these areas. So the continent still has a lot of challenges.
Syrian state media say Israel has carried out an air raid on the capital, Damascus. The state news agency said rockets struck a residential building, causing a number of deaths and injuries. It said Syrian air defences were active but gave no further details. Israel frequently attacks targets in Syria linked to Iran and Hezbollah militants, but rarely acknowledges its actions. From peanut farmer to US president to Nobel Peace Prize recipient, Jimmy Carter has lived a remarkable life. We learned he will be receiving hospice care at home, surrounded by his family, after several short stays in hospital. Our correspondent in Washington, David Willis, told me more about his condition.
The Carter Center, which he founded, issued a brief 3-sentence statement which reads, "After a series of short hospital stays, former US President Jimmy Carter today decided to spend his remaining time at home with his family and receive hospice care instead of additional medical intervention. He has the full support of his family and his medical team. The Carter family asked for privacy during this time and is grateful for the concern shown by his many admirers." We know, of course, that Mr. Carter, who is 98, has suffered a series of medical issues in recent years. He underwent hip surgery, for example, 3 years ago. He also suffered a melanoma that spread to his liver and his brain. But that said, he's lived longer already after leaving the White House than any former president in American history.
And lots of Americans must be following this really, really closely because he is just so well known by everyone.
Absolutely. And Jimmy Carter's one term in office may have been overwhelmed by the hostage crisis, of course, in Iran, economic woes at home. And indeed, by the time he left office, just 34% of Americans actually approved of the work he was doing. But over time, his reputation improved considerably to the point where 20 years after leaving office, 66% of Americans held a favourable view of him. And among the reasons for that, of course, for that rehabilitation in the public mind, if you like, was his body of humanitarian work.
David Willis. The number of people who've died in the earthquake in Turkey and Syria has risen again to more than 46,000 people. The ancient Turkish city of Antakya has been one of the most severely hit. Many of its residential tower blocks have collapsed, while historic religious sites have also been severely damaged. Our correspondent Caroline Davis has visited Antakya with a tour guide who's spent decades taking tourists around the city to see the damage firsthand.
In the old city of Antakya, nothing is recognisable. For 20 years, Mehmet Sevarulu led tourists around these ancient streets. Now even he can't find his bearings. Everything has changed, he says. As we try to find the sites he was once so familiar with, we clamber over smashed terracotta roof tiles, splintered wood and bent metal supports. Each time we climb one pile, the next is even higher, until we can't get much further safely. Above us, the contents of homes bulge precariously. Beds, chairs, bricks, doors, bursting through walls and window frames. The remainder of life here.
This was a beautiful area we took our groups to. Old Antakya houses, old Antakya streets, all destroyed, unfortunately.
We stop in front of a shop. Its awning collapsed across the entranceway.
Buradaki dükkanda 150 senedir humus.
This store used to serve hummus for 150 years. Best hummus place in Antakya. When we brought our groups to this place, they would welcome us with hot plates.
Do you know what happened to the family?
I'm not sure. All I know is that 2 are out of the area. I have no idea about the rest. Very sad.
Known as Antioch in Roman and medieval times, this city has been significant for Judaism, Islam, and was one of the earliest centres of Christianity. We find the site of an old Orthodox church only by spotting its bell, now lying at the top of a 3-metre high pile of bricks, its tower now turned to dust. Around the corner, a minaret from Saramiye Mosque lies strewn across the street.
This mosque that was built by the Ottomans, right behind it, there was a Catholic church, which is relatively new.
He points to a synagogue just up the street. The doors are locked, the holy books taken with the small community who've left for another city.
Church, mosque and synagogue, all neighbors, as you can see. They all live together like brothers.
Outside a restaurant, Mehmet makes a call to the owner, his friend.
I am afraid to call people because I don't know if they are dead or alive. So I am scared. I am relieved to hear your voice.
Our loss is great, his friend tells him. His immediate family is okay, but the partner he ran another restaurant with has died, with all his family. This was the sound of Antakya's market. Now it's empty and echoing. Outside a butcher's shop, this man weeps for his nephew who used to work there. My dear one is gone, he repeats. The world has ended for me. Across Antakya, the devastation is still raw, but Mehmet is taking comfort in the city's history and its record of resilience.
So many cultures and civilizations have been and gone here. This is not the first time it has been destroyed. It has been destroyed and rebuilt, and this time it will be reborn again. This is not how it ends for this place.
A London-based news channel broadcasting in the Persian language has said it's suspending its operations in the UK to protect its staff. Iran International said it had received warnings of serious and urgent threats to Iranian journalists. Our Middle East analyst, Sebastian Usher, told me more about what the channel had to say.
Well, Iran International is saying that 2 of its journalists had received death threats as a response to their reporting. And the general concern has been growing in recent months. The Metropolitan Police in London had reinforced security around the studios, which are in a business park in West London. They put walls there to try and prevent people being able to break in. I think the final straw was the arrest of a man of Iranian background last week who was seen taking photographs. He has since been detained. He's pleaded not guilty, but the charge, essentially accusation, is that he was looking at the area potentially for an attack. I mean, that's certainly how Iran International sees the situation. They have about 100 journalists who work here in the UK, but they also have an office with the same number in Washington, and that's essentially where they've moved their broadcast operation. So they are going to continue uninterrupted broadcasting.
And what kind of channel is Iran International? What's its viewpoint on the Iranian regime, for example?
It's very strongly in support of those who want change. And so I think that's part of a reason why this level of threat has intensified so much in recent months, as those protests that we've been reporting on, obviously the world has been reporting on in the past 4 or 5 months. And Iran International has been really at the forefront of getting that information out. I mean, it broadcasts in the Persian language, but it also has an English language and an Arabic language website, on social media. It's a big source of information too. So it presents itself as very much an independent news organization that follows the normal rules of mainstream news organizations. But it's quite clear that it is in favor of the protests. One criticism that's been about it by people who defend the regime in Iran is that it's owned by a Saudi-British businessman, and there are claims that it therefore reflects the interest of the Saudis. That's something that Iran International has always denied.
Entire homes have been destroyed, people have lost their livelihoods, hundreds of livestock died in the floods, and of course there's the death toll.
New Zealand counts the cost of Cyclone Gabrielle, which has left a trail of destruction. As Ukraine prepares to mark the anniversary of the Russian invasion next week, we can hear now from some of the men who defended one of the country's key airfields on the first day of the operation last year. They were stationed at Hostomel Airport, which fell to the Russians but was recaptured by the Ukrainian army after a fierce month-long battle. Zhana Bezpiachuk reports.
It's the first few hours of the Russian invasion. More than 30 Russian helicopters are approaching Hostomel airfield near Kiev. The first foreign boots on Ukrainian soil. It was the start of Russia's attempt to capture the capital and occupy the country. Almost 1 year later, a Ukrainian border guard is returning to the destroyed base. It's the first time he's here since the invasion. On the day of the invasion, he was the senior officer on shift. After storming the airfield, Russian troops occupied it for over a month. The border guard looks at rubbish and ruins with a sadness that can be felt even through his mask. His comments are voiced in English by an actor to protect his identity, as he is still an active member of the military.
Here was the room for officers. Russians left behind boxes of sand which they used to fortify their positions.
Tens of Ukrainian troops were captured. They were kept in the basement of the airfield. The Russian military forced Ukrainian troops to load bodies of dead Russian soldiers. The conditions were incredibly difficult.
The biggest challenge was that we didn't have enough water. We were thirsty all the time.
The Hostomel airfield was important as it was the gateway to Kiev.
One Ukrainian commander who was also there told us all those on shift that day were young conscripts left to defend the airstrip from Russia's special infantry.
When I heard that Kyiv International Airport was attacked, I realized that we would be next. They needed this airport for their military transport aircraft to transfer their hardware and personnel to seize Kyiv.
The fighting was fierce, and this commander admits his greatest fear.
That I would never see my son again. For Russians, this is not their land. They came here for their assignment. For us, this is home. Our loved ones, our friends are living here. We grew up here. This is our powerful motivation.
He describes a battle as one of David versus Goliath. His new recruits versus Russia's airborne troops.
One officer was shooting from a portable missile system Igla. He shot down helicopters, whilst conscripts helped him. They didn't have any protection from Russian fire. They were heroes.
The battle for Hostomel may have been won, but the war for Ukraine still rages on.
That was Zhana Bezpiachuk. They're still counting the cost in New Zealand, both in human life and destruction, of the cyclone that swept across North Island last Sunday. The Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, has called Cyclone Gabrielle and its aftermath the biggest natural disaster to hit New Zealand this century. Corazon Miller is a journalist at One News in Auckland. She spoke to Julian Marshall.
It's been an incredibly hard summer for many people here in New Zealand, and in particular the northern regions of New Zealand. We've had a series of incredibly bad, damaging storms, but Cyclone Gabrielle is the most significant weather event New Zealand's seen in probably this century. So some of those images you can see coming out of the worst hit areas in the Hawke's Bay, quite, to put it mildly, devastating. Those images show incredible thick layers of mud that are just coating like orchards, paddocks. Entire homes have been destroyed. People have lost their livelihoods. Hundreds of livestock died in the floods. And of course, there's the death toll. 9 people died in this incredibly powerful cyclone.
And along with the dead, a large number of people reported missing.
More than 4,000 people, officials say, are still unaccounted for. Of course, that's not necessarily an indication of the death toll. Many of those will be people who are in those areas where we simply haven't been able to get to, where there's been challenges with power outages, there's been challenges with the telecommunications systems. But officials have said they do have heightened concerns for around 10 of those that they still can't get in contact with.
And are rescue crews now able to reach the worst affected areas?
You know, it's been incredibly difficult over the last few days. Some of these regions are already been relatively isolated with quite challenging roads. But as you've probably seen from those images out of the region, many of those roads are completely destroyed. You've got layers of mud blocking them. We've got landslides. We've got trees that are crushed and broken and blocking access. And of course, you'll probably have seen some images of bridges that have just simply crumbled under the sheer force of the water as it came through. But officials are working really hard to get help to where it's needed. They're pulling in all the possible resources they have. We've got the Defence Force that's come in. They're using Navy ships and helicopters to deliver supplies and get food and water to those areas that are simply not easily accessible by road at the moment. New Zealand's also called on Australia for additional access, and I believe that there will be further details released in the coming days about what that help may look like. But of course, it's an incredibly challenging time for everyone at the moment.
And you spoke, Corazon, of people losing their livelihoods. What were their livelihoods?
The Hawke's Bay is what's been described as the fruit bowl of New Zealand. So it's an area where people are living off the land. It's a major source of fresh fruit and vegetables. We've got apples, you've got pears, you've got vineyards. And the force of the cyclone and the floods that just tore through all those large areas of land have completely destroyed many orchards, many vineyards. I've seen reports of people saying it could simply take decades for that area to get back to what it looked like before the storm hit.
That was Corazon Miller, a journalist at One News in Auckland, talking to Julian Marshall. A Bulgarian investigative journalist has said he's been banned from attending the BAFTA Awards in London on Sunday because of security concerns. Christo Grosev is credited with having helped expose an alleged plot to murder the Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. He features prominently in the documentary Navalny, which has been nominated for an award. BAFTA said that safety was its highest priority. Simon Jack spoke to Christo Grosev and began by asking him how he'd heard he wouldn't be attending the awards.
Just a couple of days before the awards, I received a message from the CNN Films team that they had received a message from the CEO of the BAFTA organization saying that based on advice from the UK police, we have decided to disinvite Christo Grosev, and neither he nor any member of his family can attend any of the BAFTA events because of concerns about public safety and security.
And did they elaborate on the nature of the security threat? Did you talk to the police about it?
Well, they did not, but to me it was clear because over the last few weeks I've received numerous alerts from different law enforcement agencies around Europe that there's credible evidence that my life is in danger, pursued by the Russian government, and that this may be actually linked to an attempt to assassinate me. I did try to offer a replacement for me. One of the other journalists who worked on this investigation, a Russian journalist based in London, and he was also banned for the same reason.
When you embarked on this documentary, did you anticipate that this would happen and you would be, if you like, have a target on your back? Or has this come as a complete surprise?
Well, it is not a complete surprise because over the last 6 years, I've conducted a number of investigations that all point to the Kremlin being complicit with crime. So that was to be expected. And I clearly remember when Alexei Navalny, the protagonist of the film, was leaving for Russia, he did tell me, Christo, until now, I was probably Putin's most likely assassination target. But after this film, which will make him look ridiculous and will be super embarrassing for him, I think he will be number one on the list. So that stayed with me, and I knew that this was going to happen one way or another. I think the film has an emotional impact on anybody who watches it, and that makes the film even more dangerous than any published investigation for the Kremlin. And I think that may have to do with the target on my back.
That was Christo Grosev speaking to Simon Jack. Fat, ugly female. just 3 of the words no longer included in new editions of Roald Dahl classics. It follows a review into the language used by one of the most popular children's authors of the 20th century. Iona Hampson reports.
Roald Dahl died in 1990, but his stories live on. More than 300 million copies of his books have been sold worldwide, and many of them have been adapted into films, including Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Matilda. Yet there have been concerns about some of the language he uses in his classics, referring to weight, mental health, violence, gender and race. Now the Roald Dahl Story Company is working on new editions in partnership with sensitivity readers. That's people advising on whether books are inclusive and accessible. The company says changes made have been small and carefully considered, but some of the amendments have sparked debate. For example, the extremely greedy child Augustus Gloop in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is now called enormous rather than fat.
I've got a perfect puzzle for you.
And Willy Wonka's workers, the Oompa Loompas, are now gender neutral and referred to as small people rather than small men.
Matilda Wormwood.
In the book Matilda, the main character now reads Jane Austen rather than the work of Rudyard Kipling, who is often associated with colonialism. Passages not written by Mr. Dahl have also been added. A description of witches being bald beneath their wigs now includes the sentence, "There are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs," and there is certainly nothing wrong with that.
Ladies, I have a plan. Andro, to transform a child into a mouse.
The amendments to The Witches come after a backlash from the disability community when the 2020 Hollywood adaptation of the book showed the Grand Witch, played by Anne Hathaway, having fingers missing from each hand. Both the actress and Warner Brothers later apologised. Roald Dahl's views have been under scrutiny for years. His family had to apologise for his anti-Semitic statements. But they added that just as he did at his best and at his absolute worst, Roald Dahl can help remind us of the lasting impact of words.
That was Iona Hampson.